In 1776, the British Army came to New York and did not leave until November of 1783. During all these years, Westchester County remained an active battleground and is undoubtedly the most fought-over ground of the Revolution. Families were divided in their loyalties between the Crown and the cause of freedom. Both sides savagely struck at each other in clashes and skirmishes all over the county, and the village of Pound Ridge was no exception. July 2nd, 1779, the largest clash of British and American horsemen in the Northern Theater of Operations took place in our village, and this is that story.
It's peaceful now. The guns are silent. Swords have been sheathed, and the people who struggled here have all passed on to history. Only the old houses, stone walls, and roads that bore mute witness to the fighting remain today. However, on July 2nd, 1779, Pound Ridge was the scene of a clash between two strong bodies of horsemen. They were known as Dragoons. At the time of the American Revolution, Pound Ridge was a prosperous farming community on the outskirts of Westchester County's battlegrounds. After the years of fighting, many believed that the village was way too far away from the fighting, and the residents went about their business, farming their fields and helping to supply George Washington with his endless call for supplies. By late May, the British line ran from Phillips House on the Hudson through Miles Square to New Rochelle on Long Island Sound. Meanwhile, Washington's army occupied positions on the Croton River and controlled the Hudson River at Stony Point and Verplanks. Hundreds of farmers left their farms and moved within the British and American lines for safety. Westchester became one of the most dangerous places for the entirety of the war.
On May 25, 1779, Sir Henry Clinton's spring campaign began with the movement of his forces from Kingsbridge to Phillips House, New Rochelle. By May 30th, the British troops marched to White Plains and simultaneously sailed troops up the Hudson River to Tellers Point. His objective was to take the American position at Stony Point and Fort Lafayette at Verplanks Point. Stony Point fell without a fight, and Fort Lafayette was forced to surrender the next day, June 1st. The British continued to move north from Fort Lafayette, and Clinton's army occupied Peekskill on June 3rd. The same day, a detachment of British Dragoons moved towards the village of Crompond and caught the militiamen by surprise, capturing many of them.
By June 13, 1779, Talmadge, in the absence of Colonel Sheldon, was acting commander of the 2nd Light Dragoons and stationed in the village of Amawalk, part of the northern Westchester County town of Somers. His tasks were manifold. First, given the contested nature of the neutral ground, reconnaissance to thwart incursions by enemy forces was critical to the safety of the civilian population and the military outposts. Second, but of no less importance, was to act as a rapid response force to blunt the effectiveness of British attacks within the 2nd Dragoons area of operation. And finally, his troops had to bolster the militia regiments in Crompond, part of Cortlandt Manor, after a British attack nearly 2 weeks earlier. From his Amawalk base, Talmadge conducted patrols around Bedford, New York, roving as far south as Greenwich, Connecticut. He often encountered British units sent out from White Plains who were running their own reconnaissance operations or raiding known rebel farmsteads for cattle and other foodstuffs.
Major Eli Leavenworth was a battle-tested commander. He took command of a 100-man infantry detachment from the Connecticut 6th Regiment that was ordered to Bedford. He was also known to have served with distinction as an intelligence officer whose job it was to track spies within the Patriot movement and stay on top of the enemy's moves. Concerned about an attack in Bedford and the possibility that the British may use the area of Westchester to launch an incursion into Connecticut, General Washington requested about 100 light infantry to secure the Bedford area. Upon arrival, Leavenworth took up a position about a mile west of Pound Ridge by a wide stone wall along what is today Route 172.
British spies reported to Sir Henry Clinton, His Majesty's commander of Crown forces in the 13 colonies, that the rebels were once again using Crompond as a military staging area for the Westchester County militia. In response, Clinton ordered another attack on that village to be led by two of his most able commanders, Lieutenant Colonel John Graves Simcoe and Lieutenant Banastre Tarleton, who share a mutual admiration and are fast friends.
They were bound for a second raid on Crompond, crossed the Croton River and Pines Bridge and attacked from two different locations. Simcoe moved first from the south, catching Drake's militia by surprise while they were eating breakfast. The mostly untrained militia fled into the woods, but Simcoe captures a large number of men and military supplies before returning to Pines Bridge to wait for Tarleton. Convinced the raid is over, the militia return and begin to reorganize their forces to pursue Simcoe. Suddenly, Tarleton's men came galloping in from the north and once again catch the militia by complete surprise, taking another large number of militia captive.
On the 27th, Talmadge writes to Washington and Heath that he is at Pound Ridge near Bedford. He also advised that we are now on pretty good ground, a little to the rear of Bedford with guards advanced to the town. Pound Ridge is rapidly turning into a sizable military camp. By this time, Washington, Heath, Talmadge, and Major Eli Leavenworth, in command of a 100-man company of the 6th Connecticut Continental Line, are all anticipating a surprise raid, like the two earlier raids on Crompond. The only question now is when.
Ebenezer Lockwood is a man of prominence in the village of Pound Ridge, and he's also a major in the Westchester County militia. At the time of the raid, he has about 100 militiamen that were mostly farmers, poorly trained, and equipped with mainly their own hunting rifles. The British were after men like Lockwood because he was an officer in the Westchester militia and had anti-British sentiments. He had a price on his head of 40 guineas, which at that time was about $100.
Both sides employed spies during the American Revolution, in order to gain otherwise unavailable information on the other's plans and status of forces. It was an extremely hazardous occupation, and if caught, public execution by hanging was the punishment to be meted out. Luther Kennicott, a carpenter by trade, was one such patriot who offered his services as a spy. His modus operandi was to travel from village to village, working his way below British lines, offering things to sell. With Westchester County in ruins from the war and Loyalist refugees seeking safety within the British lines, it was extremely common for people to try and sell their remaining possessions for money to purchase food. Kennicott appeared to be just such another down-and-outer trying to survive.
Colonel Elisha Sheldon is the commander of the 2nd Regiment of Light Dragoons. For the last month, he was in Connecticut attending to regimental and personal business. He returned to Pound Ridge the day before the battle and speaks with Major Talmadge about the spies report as well as the operational matters. He has reservations about the spy report, but keeps an open mind for security and safety reasons. He is also informed that Colonel Stephen Moyland and his regiment of dragoons are on the way to join him at Pound Ridge, but their exact arrival is not known. Major Lockwood offers Sheldon to use his home as headquarters and a place to live, which he gladly accepts. During the day, the weather has been deteriorating and a bad storm was brewing. Concerned about the rumors of pending attack, Mrs. Lockwood speaks to her husband and Sheldon about moving to Ridgefield, since she is 8 months pregnant. But the pending storm, Sheldon did his best to convince her to wait until morning. He tells her that the British would never turn out in a severe rainstorm. To be safe, though, Sheldon orders the horses to remain saddled, and he keeps troops ready for anything. Additionally, he deployed vedettes to cover all the roads leading into Pound Ridge.
Throughout the day, Tarleton's officers prepared themselves for the long ride to Pound Ridge. Concerned about spies, they would not assemble their force until well after dark. Later that day, a storm that was building all afternoon finally let loose with a torrential rain. Tarleton orders his men to mount their horses at 11:30 p.m. He departs from Miles Square in Armonk and travels northward to North Castle Church in present-day Mount Kisco. With him, Tarleton has a force of roughly 300 horsemen. His command includes 200 troops from his own legion, 70 troopers from the 17th Light Dragoons, Queen's Rangers, and Hessian Jaegers. It has taken over 4 hours for Tarleton's force to move roughly 10 miles. He knows he is already behind schedule and won't be able to strike at dawn as hoped. Despite this, Tarleton orders a halt to rest the horses and meet with his spies. In the meeting, the spies warn Tarleton that Sheldon and the Dragoons are still in Pound Ridge, and that Major Eli Leavenworth, with 100 Continental troops, are stationed on the southern road from Bedford to Pound Ridge. Tarleton passes the northern side of Bedford and continues along present-day Route 121. His men are soaked from the heavy rains, and he can see that the eastern sky is getting light. Despite the setbacks, Tarleton believes that his force is still undetected. Not a single shot fired by a sentry or a challenge from a patrol. He now knows he is getting close as he turns the force up Stonehill Road. Tarleton sees a farmer named John Crawford standing in his door watching the British column ride by. He asks for directions, and Crawford tells him that he needs to continue straight up Stonehill Road and make a right turn at the next intersection. Tarleton thanks him and continues on his way. Unknowingly, his luck has just run out. Half a mile away from the Crawford house stands a large rock formation rising up from the low marshy area. Known today as Spy Rock, it offered a commanding view of the countryside, and Sheldon has stationed a few vedettes there to keep watch. Within minutes, a mounted dragoon begins his descent down from the hill to warn Sheldon of what they have seen: men and horses coming from Bedford along the North Road. Tarleton's force continues their march, but they mistake Crawford's directions and miss the turn. By the time the British realize they're going in the wrong direction, the entire column has to be turned about, and Tarleton knows that he is quickly losing the element of surprise. He had hoped to be in Pound Ridge before the Americans were up and organized for their day.
The storm raged all night, and both the Lockwoods and Sheldon stayed up all night. By morning, Sheldon must have felt vindicated, and all started to relax. He ordered the horses to be unsaddled and for the men to stand down. Moments later, a vedette that was stationed on Spy Rock burst through the door to report a large body of horsemen were on their way. It was too dark when they observed the horsemen, so they could not identify if it was friend or foe. Sheldon says to Mrs. Lockwood that it's probably Moylan, but orders the regiment to resaddle the horses and prepare to meet Moylan or the British. At the same time, he orders Talmadge to take a party of dragoons to ride forward and see who is coming.
Taking only a small group of troopers, Talmadge gallops out from Pound Ridge to confirm the incoming forces, hoping, as are everyone else, that this is Colonel Moylan and his 4th Light Dragoons. But as they come around a bend in the road, they see not Moylan and the 4th, but the advance guard of a 200-man British column. Talmadge's contingent brings their mounts to an abrupt stop, wheel about to get away, and return to Pound Ridge post-haste. A British officer commands them to stop, to no effect, and fires at their retreating backs. Talmadge and his corps of troopers race back to the village with the entire mounted British element hard on their heels. Meanwhile, back in Pound Ridge, the sound of gunfire has alerted Sheldon and the remaining 2nd Dragoons that the anticipated British attack is underway.
When the British first entered Pound Ridge, the militia scattered and ran into swampy and wooded areas, knowing that the horse-mounted British couldn't follow them.
For Prudence Lockwood, it must have seemed exciting to see so much happening in her small village that morning. She was the daughter of Joseph Lockwood, who, at the time of the raid, was only 11 years old and witnessed the battle from and around her house.
Shortly before 7 a.m., Sheldon and his regiment are forming behind the meeting house when a shot rings out from the direction Talmadge went to investigate. At this point, every dragoon in Pound Ridge knew who was coming and quickly made their last preparations to meet a British dragoon force head-on. As Talmadge and his men came galloping back into the village, Sheldon opened his ranks to let men pass through. Then, as the British advance guard approached, Sheldon ordered his men to charge so as to minimize the brunt of the assault. For about 7 or 8 minutes, Pound Ridge was a chaotic mess of horses and men slashing and hacking at each other with swords. Sheldon's men stood firm, giving as good as they got. However, as an endless line of British horsemen moved around the fight to cut off the road to Bedford, Sheldon knew he had only one road to the south open to him and ordered to withdraw. To his credit, Sheldon tried to make another stand in the fields below the town, but the amount of British horse troops continued to pour out of the town, and his withdrawal continued. At the fork in the road that led to Scott's Corners of Stamford, Sheldon's regiment split from Talmadge and Lockwood, heading to Scott's Corners, and Sheldon climbing the road to Stamford. During the withdrawal, Sergeant Gerard Hoyt was slashed by a British dragoon in the back of his head. Instinctively, Hoyt swung his sword in a wild backhanded stroke and hit the man in the mouth, nearly severing the man's jaw. In another confrontation, a British dragoon called out to John Buckout, "Surrender, you damn rebel, or I will blow your brains out." Buckout refused and kept riding. The man pulled the trigger and a bullet grazed Buckout's head. The British horseman yelled, "There, you damned rebel! A little more and I should have blown your brains out." Buckout reported, "Yes, damn you, and a little more and you wouldn't have touched me."
During the battle, they eventually Tarleton's men approached the house of Mrs. Sarah Lockwood. This was Major Lockwood's mother. And those soldiers inquired as to which way the damned rebels had gone. Sarah Lockwood replied, "I know of no rebels but yourselves, and you are rebelling against the Almighty." She absolutely encompassed the spirit of Pound Ridge women that day. A few of Tarleton's men broke off during the raid and approached the house of Judge William Francher. At the time, only Mrs. William Francher was home. The soldiers noticed a chest that was locked, and in it contained numerous documents of importance. The soldiers decided that they needed to enter this chest and immediately started harassing Mrs. Francher to open it. She refused. And the soldier was about to become abusive when another soldier said, "Stop," went outside, retrieved a rock, and broke into the chest. The chest, unfortunately, did provide certain documents that the troops went away with.
When the militia scattered, a militiaman named William Brown and his son moved south and saw the British troops enter the Francher home. When the British left the house, Brown and his son fired shots at them and knocked one off the horse and killed him.
Mrs. Ebenezer Lockwood was also home. Amongst things that they found were the regimental flags. She refused to give up certain things and tried to walk past the British soldiers. They, even though she was 8 months pregnant, swung a sword at her stomach, refusing to let her pass. She, amongst many of the women in Pound Ridge that day, absolutely showed their spirit.
It was clear that Tarleton would never be able to catch Sheldon's regiment in order to fight and destroy them. Near the New York-Connecticut border, he orders a halt to the chase and has his trumpeter sound recall. So far, his raid has not accomplished its objective, and he needs to rest the horses that have made the 8.5-hour journey. He turns his force around and begins to head back to Pound Ridge.
After reorganizing the command, Sheldon begins to move towards Pound Ridge in a pursuit of the British. He moves slowly, cautiously, to avoid a British ambush. Sheldon, Talmadge, and Lockwood rejoin where they split. Sheldon remains cautious because Tarleton's force still outnumbers the American Dragoons. He hasn't heard any musket fire from Leavenworth's men and does not know if his command was destroyed, captured, or combat effective.
With Tarleton's entire force back in Pound Ridge, he orders the Lockwood home and the meeting house burned because they were used for military purposes. Although the surgeons asked that Tarleton spare the house that they were using as a field hospital, he refuses the request and orders them to move the wounded to the outside yard. Once completed, the Lockwoods' house and all their possessions are burned. The large plume of smoke lets inhabitants know what is happening.
During the raid, Major Ebenezer Lockwood's son-in-law, Alsop Hunt, was taken prisoner. His wife, Betsy, decided that she would not let her husband go alone. She mounted the horse and rode with him all the way to Yonkers.
Sheldon begins to move his force toward Pound Ridge. He knows the local militia have started moving closer to engage Tarleton's men because he can hear pot shots being made at the British. Sheldon and the men of his command know that Tarleton is preparing to withdraw from Pound Ridge, as their tactic is to burn property before vacating a town. He decides to creep forward, hoping that the sight of his dragoons will hasten Tarleton's departure.
Tarleton knows that he is deep in enemy territory and has no desire to get surrounded. With the militia becoming more brazen and taking shots at his men, he begins to organize his force for the withdrawal. He knows that Sheldon is on the road to the south and receives word that Major Leavenworth is moving his men east toward Pound Ridge. This left only the northern route that he came in on available for him. To deceive Leavenworth, Tarleton has a few of his men move around in small formations to look as though they are forming for an attack on him. Meanwhile, out of sight, the British have actually begun their retreat on the route they came in on. By 11 a.m., Tarleton knows that most of his force has passed Stonehill Road and is moving quickly back towards Bedford Village. He begins by pulling his troops along the Bedford Road back to the village heights. He orders the home of Joseph Lockwood to be burned as the last remaining troops are preparing to leave. As a group of British soldiers with firebrands enter the house to burn it, the militia fire at them. One of the dragoons yells, "The rebels are upon us," and they all run to their horses and race to catch up to Tarleton's retreating force.
It didn't take long for Leavenworth to realize that he had been deceived. By 11:15, he began moving his force towards Pound Ridge. The younger, faster soldiers he ordered to cross the field in an attempt to head off Tarleton. Leavenworth and Sheldon enter Pound Ridge at about the same time. They find wounded men lying everywhere around the grounds of Major Lockwood's burned home.
As Sheldon and his command enter Pound Ridge, they see wounded in the yard, and the Lockwood home was in flames. Above him, on the heights, he could see that the meeting house where all the regiment's equipment was being stored was engulfed in flames. Sheldon met with Leavenworth to plan the pursuit of Tarleton. Once ready, they began following. Ahead of them, they could still hear the militia taking pot shots at Tarleton's men. The steep rocky ground along Stonehill Road made it impossible for the British to attack the militia on horseback.
All along Stonehill Road, militiamen fire at the British as they retreat. Tarleton has one last stop to make, though. At the home of John Crawford, the man who gave Tarleton directions, he orders the house to be burned. And with the house in flames, Tarleton and his rear party continue on their way to join the main body of the force in Bedford. By noon, Tarleton and the last of the British forces arrive in Bedford. Upon entering the village, he sees that militiamen from all around the area are firing upon his men. Little by little, they are creeping forward, trying to get within range. At first, they are firing from far distance and posing no real threat. But as they creep forward and start using buildings as cover, Tarleton issues a warning to them. If they continue, he will burn any building that they are firing from. Not heeding the warning, the militia continue to fire, so Tarleton has his men burn the meeting house and the home of Benjamin Hayes.
As Sheldon moved down Stonehill Road, he came across the home of John Crawford, engulfed in flames. He could only ignore the Crawford family standing in the yard with only a few worldly possessions and continued toward Bedford. Always he could hear the militia firing at the British. By the time Sheldon and Leavenworth reach Bedford, the British are gone, leaving behind a few buildings in flames. At North Castle Church, Sheldon finally gives up the pursuit and heads back to Pound Ridge. When he enters the village, the Lockwood home and the meeting house have collapsed into the foundations, and sparks and smoke still bellow up into the air.
His men and horses are exhausted, but he sits down at 11 p.m. to write his report to Sir Henry Clinton, and in his report he claims that they killed, wounded, or captured 26 or 27 of Sheldon's dragoons.
On the next day, Sheldon orders his men to saddle their horses and to move the regiment to South Salem, near Richfield, where he established his headquarters. While there, he wrote his official report to Washington and had a courier delivered to his staff.
The raid on Pound Ridge was over, but the American Revolution would go on for another 3 years. Colonel Sheldon and the 2nd Regiment would continue to go on patrols throughout Westchester County and clash in small skirmishes with the British. Not long after the raid on Pound Ridge, Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton was transferred to fight in the South with Lord Cornwallis till the end of the war. Major Benjamin Talmadge continued on till the end of the war, serving in the 2nd Light Regiment of Dragoons and serving as General Washington's spy master, operating the famous Culper spy ring out of New York City. Major Ebenezer Lockwood moved his family to Ridgefield as he originally planned. Later, he rebuilt their house that still stands where the original stood. On the back of the house is a small marker that identifies the site of Colonel Sheldon's headquarters during that battle.
I shall always remember Tarleton's men, charging through the village in pursuit of Colonel Sheldon's men, standing in their stirrups and whirling their swords over their heads.